This will be lecture 11, the second lecture for today, day 4. This will be on Native American voices. And of course, as with all of these selections, I'm only looking at a couple of representative texts. So there is a huge variety in Native American literature if you're interested. Before I get to that, before I get to the specifics, one thing that we notice in a lot of indigenous writing, but also Native American writing, just as we looked at, for example, Eastern Kide's novel "When the River, Where the River Sleeps," the idea of shape shifting, right, and animals. So the animal world is especially powerful. Anthropologists tell us this, but so do the novels and the literary works. So we may see some indication of that in the works we're looking at, but even if we don't, it's something that all Native American writing is aware of, and sort of the blurred boundaries between the human and non-human. So to that end, I would like to refer to a couple of other terms in eco-criticism. One was mentioned, someone was mentioning bioregionalism. So, right? So that's important because it occurred to me that Native American works, indigenous works, are particularly bioregional. What is bioregionalism? I'll just give a quick definition and then move on to one other term. So in the 1970s, this was conceived by sociologists to mean a particular place that people call or think of as their home that they identify with, which encompasses both the natural community, the natural surroundings, the environment, as well as the human community. The community is invested in the land, kind of like the land ethic that Aldo Leopold talks about, and shares a common way of life and sensibility shaped by that environment. That we see in a lot of Native American works. Or conversely, we see the loss of that if it's set in urban environments. And this also resists the conventional dominant view of hierarchies and divisions. That is the ideal, in any case, of bioregionalism. And so it decenters those hierarchies, and it also it can show how rituals and customs reflect these ties to the land, these interconnections. For example, in the Hungry Tide, one could say that for the fisher folk who live there and earn their livelihood from it, the Sundarbans, the mangrove forests, constitute a bioregion, right? And so the tensions with outsiders is one of the many features of that novel. So when outsiders come in and don't understand the bioregion. So it's just one other concept to think about. Another one is, which I found a little slippery, but that has received a lot of attention in a book that came out 13 years ago called Eco-Ambiguity, and by Karen Thornburg. And she looks at Southeast Asian writing, which is her specialty, to describe literary works, both in the past and current, that do not directly address environmental crises, but which you can read as reflections of environmental crises. So by crises, we mean things I think we all understand: deforestation, the damming of rivers and displacement of people, which also disrupts the ecosystem, industrial pollution, climate change. We saw this with Gift in Green, right? Very similarly. So eco-ambiguity is what she calls the complex, contradictory interactions between people and the non-human environment. So sometimes they may interact with the environment in ways that seem counterproductive to their own interests, right? And so, how do you look at this? Sometimes you have to look at zoom in and look very closely at a specific action, but then you have to look out and put it in the context of a larger action. I think the key word is ambiguity, rather than, because of the sciences from which eco-criticism has drawn so much of its original impetus and still does, is its whole premise is fact-based, right? Empirical, which is good. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it's a different way of relating to the world, which does not account for those nuances that humans bring to this, right? Which humans are complicated as well. And not all creatures also, or plants or animals or trees, act the same way. Finally, and more importantly, as I was alluding to, in Native American lore, animal studies is a big point. And I thought it would be useful to just mention that Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher, in 1975, oh, that's exactly 50 years ago, his book Animal Liberation. Interesting, because this follows the 1960s idea of civil rights, right? Not coincidentally, then we start to see, well, can we extend this, right? So he's a philosopher, so he looks at the logic of saying, he's a utilitarian. He follows Jeremy Bentham. And so he says, who argued famously that animal cruelty was similar to human slavery, and that the capacity to feel pain, not the power of reason, entitled a being to moral consideration, as Greg Girard puts it. So in other words, reason was still the part of the Enlightenment. I know this gets a bit philosophical, but bear with me. So how, by logic, we cannot say that animals don't feel pain. Now we know they feel emotion, and we keep finding out more and more how similar we are to at least some animals, non-human animals, as we should say, whether it's chimpanzees, whales, elephants, whatever. So Singer called this bias that we bring of anthropocentrism speciesism. Sometimes I see it come up, that word. Now, this is all from still a very European kind of model, but it's interesting how it does work. It does kind of fit with the indigenous worldview that sees these blurred boundaries. Another critic is Mary Midgley in 1983, talks about animal welfarism. So she's not going as far as Singer in saying that, every animal is exactly this, has the same rights as all humans. She does, however, say that we have to think about. She is an animal rights person, but we have to think about what is good for that animal's habitat, right? And so there are other ways of looking at these. Science writers, it's interesting to see, are also turning to poetic words to try to express these, there's a word called Umwelt, which is in that actually arose, a German, coined in the 70s also by a German scientist, to say how each organism reacts to the world. We have to understand that on their basis. It could be even a tiny organism. By the same token, then, we tend to see animals as reacting to the world in the ways we do. It's hard not to, but we cannot. We can no longer assume that. And then, of course, we come to Donna Haraway, whom I've mentioned. That leads us into posthumanism, because it begs the question of what human means, right? And that is a huge philosophical issue, and of course, many great people have talked about this, but again, if we are no longer entirely, if we think human is all about cells as well as consciousness, now we have, as we said, microplastics in us, or we have titanium legs, or whatever the case may be. And it's not a negative. It's she just says, well, we are cyborgs, right? So then the question becomes, how do we make? What are the ethics of that? And now we do have people. For example, I have a colleague who's a philosopher who does medical ethics. They have to constantly keep thinking. Like now we have AI, right? Artificial intelligence. So by this, and analogously with issues of what is life, what is sentience, when do we, is someone in a vegetative state whose heart is pumping still alive, those kinds of things. So these are the questions that I think enter in. Not that we have to bring all those to bear on what we read in a literary text, but it's important to keep in mind the fact that what we naturally assume to be human may be just an assumption. Maybe. And I think that's what Native American texts, on one level, push us to think about. Right? They don't say, come down on one side or the other. The other thing, though, I should say is the other thing is that when we look at animals, what Peter Singer said in looking at animals in 1980 was that it's an interesting argument that before, sort of in pre-modern times, roughly, meaning when people were living off the land, and some people still do, but generally, when you look at an animal, like a farmer has, even today, a farmer may have no problem with naming a pig or a chicken and, nice, give them a name and then kill them and eat them. Or sell it. That sounds cruel, but actually, it's actually less cruel than pretending we don't see this, and it's all manufactured and then packaged, right? I know that's one reason, aside from reasons, many, even the West also, many are turning to veganism and so forth. But the point is that Peter Singer made this interesting argument that when we look at an animal returns our gaze, there's sort of an uncanny moment, because on the one hand, we feel a kinship, right? I mean, it's hard not to look at a puppy and right, feel like, until they grow up. But then we still have, on the other hand, a distance. It's kind of like that uncanny valley of the idea of robots, right? Which was coined by a Japanese critic in the 70s or 80s. This idea that using the uncanny idea that when we see robots that are too lifelike, it's very estranging because they're familiar on the one hand, but they're definitely different on another. We see this in movies where they do I find it eerie when they have certain, those animated movies where they take actors and then they use a kind of animated form of them. And it's kind of like strange. So the same thing happens, he says, with looking into an animal's eyes. These are ways in which, these are very European ways of looking at it. What happens when we look through, say, Native American texts? One reason that made me think of this is we've had a couple of doctoral students in our department. I have a colleague who's a Native American studies expert. And so I sometimes come in for the post-colonial theory content. And so I haven't read these texts, but there's a huge boom in Native American writing, Canadian and North American, by young writers, in which they take certain legendary or folk figures like the Wendigo, which is a kind of monstrous figure, or the White Buffalo Woman. These are mythic ideas, and they put them in the present day, and they become kind of an eco-horror, but they are also a haunting. And I'm just giving you a tidbit here. This idea of haunting about the trauma of what they've been through, but it's not entirely negative. So to that end, I have a couple of images, Ankita, which are just very simple ones. One is Devil's Tower. Yeah. So I was mentioning this the other day. I said there was a legend of the Kiowa, and I was saying it was kind of a heads up for Scott Momaday, and whom we're going to look at. And he talks about this actually in an interview I saw on television. And that you can see how I've been to this at the base. It's fascinating because there's this plane around here, and then suddenly this thing sits up, right? That's because everything else has eroded around it. So that looks like scars on the side that the legend says, the Kiowa legend says, was made by a giant bear, right? Now that's important because it's sacred. All the mountains and rivers, we know this in India is true, in many parts of the world, but sometimes North America, the dominant culture forgets that, right? If it's on a reservation, now this is on public government land, but if it's on a reservation, you cannot hike, no outsider can hike on there. So we have a reservation near us, Fort Hall, where you can go just to the entryway, where they have a casino. That's a big thing that Native Americans are allowed to do. But you can't go to further inside without permission. So they are sort of semi-autonomous, but they are spiritual. And that's the reason, right? So Scott Momaday's House Made of Dawn came out in 1968, and the title is taken from the traditional literature of the Diné people. The Diné is a broad term, and it really just means the people. And Kiowa is one of the sort of clans or subgroups within the larger group. He died just last year at the age of 89. And Joy Harjo, the poet I started this week with, said that, quote unquote, Momaday found a way to move eloquently between oral storytelling forms and the written English novel form. The trajectory of the novel moves from sunrise to sunrise, making a circle, a story structure recognizable in indigenous oral history, yet following traditional American literary shape and the expectations of the novel, of the modern novel. So, House Made of Dawn. I love that poetic title. As Harjo notes, his title, and many others have noted, not just her, she wrote this in tribute to him just last year. But he is credited with inaugurating the Native American Renaissance in writing. And that's pretty recent, right? Late 1960s. Now it's boom time, if you're interested, which I don't read as much of this, but I've taught this novel. It opens with the protagonist named Abel. Has anyone read this? Curious? I'm just curious, that's all. He returns to a reservation in New Mexico. There's another image, I forgot what it was. Yeah, now I remember. So the other image is, we saw the photographs, so we're in the age of photographs, right? But this is I alluded to earlier to the beginning of today, where this is a hand-drawn map, Native American map, from maybe 100 years ago or more. And the topographies are interesting, right? So it's not only giving mountains, which are the triangular shapes, but it also apparently, this is from a website which I will put in my notes, the link, which is, those are indicators of petroglyphs. Petroglyphs, right? We have them in India to some degree. And that is where we have many of them in North America. Some are etched in and some are drawn in red pigment, ochre. Those are spiritual for them, right? So what matters on a map? Maps are, what is it? It's all cultural, right? It's what we think is important, right? And there you'd say, well, that doesn't look like a map, but it is meaningful to the people who created it a long time ago. So we mustn't think that indigenous peoples did not have maps or did not have petroglyphs themselves were sometimes a marker of place that they would know where to go. So I thought that was interesting. And by the way, if you're interested, I have the website on the notes, and this is done by sociologists who, not literary critics, who are digitizing some of these and talking about how you can teach them. So it's really interesting. Sort of cross-disciplinary multimedia. So the other thing about Devil's Tower, may I say, and this you can see is quite distinct from this map, is that we see it in the novel. Somewhere in the middle of the novel it's described. That's why I showed it. But it's also become a kind of, gained a lot of fame in a 1977 film by Spielberg called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You don't have to go look at this, but this guy is haunted. It's a white guy, a middle-class guy, and he's haunted by these aliens are communicating with him, but he doesn't know it. And so he keeps making shapes like out of his potatoes and all. He makes shapes that look like Devil's Tower, and he's never seen Devil's Tower. So he takes his whole family and he goes there and so forth. And then an alien ship comes down. Well, the inside story of this is that the location scout, whose name is Joe Alves, he was told to find an unusual piece of topography. So he goes there, and as he's scouting, then he learns, or really after filming, he learns to appreciates the spiritual significance of it to the several Native American tribes. So it's ironic that he takes a movie, this modern medium of popular, it's a popular kind of film, and that causes this location scout to really appreciate this landscape. And he says, if this made him think, if aliens were to come, why wouldn't they choose a place like this? It heightened the creative and spiritual sense of the film, which led to it a much bigger film. Though it must be said, Native Americans make no appearance in the film. But still, he learned something. Okay, anyway, back to Abel. He's the other aspect is there's trauma in a lot of these texts. Already he's disconnected from, he's drafted into World War II, right? So this novel came out in 1968, and so it's set more or less in that present. So roughly a little over 20 years before this, he's drafted into World War II. He's crippled psychologically. He doesn't recognize, he's so drunk, he doesn't recognize his own grandfather who helped raise him, right? And this guy, his name is Francisco, and he had taught Abel all the traditions and values of the Kiowa. And these are directly tied to the landscape, right? And so, by the way, independently of this, there's a wonderful series of novels by a white guy, but he was an honorable tribal member named Tony Hillerman that are mystery novels set in this area, the Navajo mostly, but it's very similar kind of landscape if you're interested. They've just recently filmed it with an all Native American cast, Native American director, cinematographer, everything, and they have the spiritual aspects, supernatural aspects that we would say supernatural, are just presented as real. So I just thought that was interesting. Okay, well, to my knowledge, this has not been filmed yet, but there are a lot. That's another area. Some of you are in film studies where Native American film is starting to be important. So the novel his whole idea is the novel is about his really difficult time adjusting both to coming back from World War II, but also he tries to make a go of it in Los Angeles, so that it's a very alienating, like any city, right? And if you go to the new, like you saw Devil's Tower, it's very wide open. It's a very different landscape. So that's going on. Um, and Francisco tells him stories from his life and tells him that you need to reconnect with your people. And when he dies, Abel dresses him for burial and covers his own body with ashes. It's a ritual form. At dawn, he starts to run, enacting the funeral ritual his grandfather had described to him. While running, Abel sings for San Francisco and also for his own soul. So we understand that he's returned to his people and finally understood his place in the world. And place, we sometimes use that very loosely, your place in the world, but this is really place. This is bioregional place. Now, I should say that there's also a motif, there's also a theme about he's a runner. So running was part of this ritual. But he happens to be a runner. They still to this day have this running. What's it called? The Jimenez. Anyway, if I see it here in my notes, I'll tell you what it's called. Oh yeah, Jemez, Jemez, Jemez runners. Where some of these traditions have been revived very and really nicely. Where in Fort Hall, I've been to the what is called a powwow. I don't know if you've heard that term, but a powwow is a generic, the Native Americans use it, but they all have different languages. So it's just become a group term for Canadian and American tribes to come together and share dances, have dance competitions, share their wares, and sell some things to tourists, right? But they're not aggressively selling. It's like they're just laid back, and it's really neat to watch that. And the reason I mention that is they also have a bareback horse race, no saddle, and they're usually young people, and they're all on these horses, and they go really fast around this track. So they are keeping these traditions. They're trying. Momaday's protagonist is a Kiowa Indian who's begun to lose his heritage, as we said. And so we are sort of experiencing this with him. And also, like Chinua Achebe or others, writers, he puts a few terms in the novel that he does not define. We can infer what they are from the context. Some of these terms, for example, are culebra. Sometimes they have Spanish, they borrowed from the Spanish, which is also part of Mexican American. When we get to Native American, this is also Native Mexican American, or what we call Hispanic, Latino, they're different terms, areas. Concho, Hostin, things like that. They also mention, I don't know if you've heard, the word squaw, which is a derogatory term that thankfully very few people are using, but whites had used it for 150 years, thinking, modern whites thought it was, the dominant culture thought it was a legitimate term. Turns out it is a Native American term, but it's more like saying whore. And they use this for all Native American women. So you can imagine, right? The other thing I thought I'd mention, which is to give you an insight into how slow things change. When I moved to where I live now, which is also, Native American territory, Pocatello, where Idaho State sits on Native American Shoshone land, 25 years ago, there was a peak, a hill that's a prominent one. There are a few others, and they called it Chinks Peak. If you know American lingo, that is a derogatory term for the Chinese that was used in World War II and earlier. They helped build a railroad that made that a railroad town. There, in front of our building, English department, there's a narrow gauge track from the 1880s that's preserved, a small section, as a memorial, right? Chinese, some Japanese Americans, in other words, if you go to the cemetery, you have gravestones in Chinese, Greek, and so on. And yet they all suffer this discrimination, right? And so until recently, and Chinks Peak, when all of us got there, we were like, what? Where are these people, living? What, this is not what you use. Finally, they changed it to Chinese Peak 4 years after that. So I'm just telling you that there are still a lot of derogatory terms. Okay, the other thing I want to leave you with is this the idea, and I don't know when I started, but the idea of, the way I read this is that these terms that are not defined are not estranging. I think they are meant to give an air of authenticity, as we've said, but they are not meant, after all, he wants the readers of all kinds to appreciate this world, right? You don't want to alienate the reader. And the irony is that even Abel is having to learn his traditions, right? So that kind of, in a way, invites the reader, the dominant, say the non-Native American reader, to feel empathize with him, because, hey, how do I appreciate this landscape? Some themes and symbols. There's religious syncretism. There's Catholicism and Native American traditions, very common. There are ritual songs and stories. Remember I mentioned animal studies? Eagles and other birds and animals, horses, bears, coyotes, fish. Someone mentioned disability studies. There are damaged bodies. Abel's hands, he also kills a man. That's another part of a story, and so on. Momaday's novel, and I'm coming to the end here, also contrasts the quiet, natural landscape of the reservation with the bustling city of Los Angeles, accentuating how this urban existence is alienating and isolating for Abel, as it is for so many. And like all great novels, writers, he does not romanticize them. And one way, I'll give you one example, he describes Abel's scorn for an albino Indian, right? Troubling. He's not going to shy away from that. Oh, thank you. He's not going to shy away from that. Louise Erdrich, Tracks. Has anyone read Louise Erdrich, I wonder? Erdrich. It's a German surname, but she is part Native American from the Anishinaabe people. There are many, couple hundreds of different clans. There are some large groupings, and I'm not well versed in these myself. The point is, though, the other thing to keep in mind is some tribes are losing their language, others are reviving it. But these were not written languages, right? As we're familiar with that in India, in certain languages. These were oral. So, for example, I had a colleague, he's retired now, he was hired, he left the university for 3 years because he was well paid by one of the tribes to develop a written system, right? So, a linguist, he's a linguist. So, and so they are still trying this, but to my knowledge, I don't think there are any works of fiction in Native. I may be wrong, but not that I've heard of. They tend to be in English. So, the other thing is communal identity. I think we should point. So in Tracks, it alternates between two narrators: Nanapush, a jovial tribal elder, and Pauline, a young girl of mixed heritage. So different tribes have different rules about how much blood genetically you need to be a member of the tribe, right? I have someone in our department, a doctoral student. To give an example of the complexity, Lawrence, he's very Native American, looks Native American, but he grew up in Los Angeles. He left. His parents grew up on this reservation near us, but since a young age, he grew up in Los Angeles or somewhere like that. He came back to the Pocatello, and they would not allow him to become a member because they said, you have never lived on the reservation. So that's another rule. And he got annoyed. He said, to hell with it, I don't want to become a member. So you can see these tensions today that are part of. I just give you a real life story, right? Um, so Nanapush is telling stories to his granddaughter Lulu um, about things that happened in the past. So part of the novel is a recollection, and these occurred quite early on, 1912 to 1924. Eldridge has, haven't read all her work by any means. She has a number of, she likes to delve into the history of some of the similar characters, but also in the present. Her first collection, which sometimes it's a novel, described as a novel, but you know how sometimes writers can take different short stories and piece it together to make a novel. So you can read it each chapter independently. It's called Love Medicine, and that deals with, for example, a Vietnam War veteran. Like Abel, he's a kind of updated version, similar version, who's uh, has post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. You can also, by the way, think of, it's very interesting to see how Native American veterans of the Army are very proud of that service, even as they are ambivalent about it, because they were not accepted, right? When they fought, especially in World War II, as full citizens, and yet they're proud of that. So there's this idea of the ritual aspect, the duty, the idea of duty to a larger cause, but that doesn't take away the fact that uh, they have had to endure racism and so forth. There's also this idea of health and uh, bringing someone who's sick with tuberculosis, treating them. An epidemic has, this is over 100 years ago, these events, even though the novel is published in 1988, where tuberculosis had claimed the lives of some of them. Probably the main emotion in the novel is a kind of shared grief over that loss, over the loss of so many members. So that's that haunting I mentioned. The grief haunts them, right? Now that's very psychological haunting, and I don't believe it takes the form of any particular human or animal, but nonetheless, it's there. Um, Here's an interesting aspect, though. So, Edrich, just like some other writers, will, again, they're not magic realist novels by any means, they're realist, but they will introduce some things that make you think. So, what happens is Fleur, this young woman in the family, is at one point beaten and raped by four men. So she leaves the town. She's just obviously, I can't imagine that. She leaves the town. The next day, a tornado comes through the town, and the only people killed are the four men. Is this divine justice? Right? There's no explanation, right? And there aren't many of these sorts of events, right, in the novel. So it forces you to think about, and that's a natural sort of occurrence, right? It forces you to think about things like fate and so forth. So they begin a new family unit. Notice that, like a lot of Native Americans, they have, I've had students, for example, who will say, we just have, you can sleep in each other's homes in your extended family. It doesn't matter. You come and go, right? And so in this way, you start to have an extended family. It's not that sort of tiny nuclear family like in a city. And a new family unit starts to grow. And throughout the novel, Margaret and Nanapush, he's the key, he's the grandfather, whom Fleur sees as a father figure, he starts to develop a relationship with Margaret. Now, this situation is interesting. Is not, you'll see it. There's some correspondence with Viramonte's novel Under the Feet of Jesus, which talks about 19 70s, 60s, 70s Hispanic, Mexican American laborers in the fields, where these extended families are what is key. But together, the family has to deal with hunger, tribal conflict, and ultimately the loss of their land to the government. So here's that eco-critical idea. Um, there's also no romanticizing here. Pauline, who does a lot of good, she takes care of people tending the sick and dying. She decides to join a Catholic convent after having a vision, right? So you see all these complexities. But she becomes more and more obsessed with, and also eaten up by jealousy of this other woman, a Flare. And so you have, this is again 1988, so you have these characters who are trying to make a go of it in a modern world where they still want to cling to things, their traditions, and what makes that the key tie are stories. We talked about that the other day, storytelling. Right. Like Morrison's Beloved, Tracks presents us with spirits and hauntings which are, on one level, very real to the novel's characters. On another level, they represent the tensions and traumas, of course, that Native peoples are forced to endure as they face a white settler world that has effectively erased them from its consciousness. For example, Nanapush describes the grief he and Fleur endure, as I mentioned, right? And this is what he says. We had gone half Wendigo. I learned later that this was common, that there were many of our people who died in this manner, of the invisible sickness. There were those who could not swallow another bite of food because the names of their dead anchored their tongues. That's grief sickening them. They haven't got tuberculosis. Now, a Wendigo, as I just briefly mentioned earlier, in the lore of many Native American tribes, not all, is a monstrous creature that feeds on humans. A figure whose isolation from others has corrupted its soul, again, because lack of community. That's what happens to Abel, right? This can become a metaphor for the corruption of the human soul, right? This grief nearly drives them mad. That's why he says, we had gone half Wendigo. He means really almost mad and monstrous. Flare, after losing a child, seems to drift towards madness. One critic has argued that madness is a manifestation of the Native American community's trauma following the deforestation of their homeland by loggers, a theme that we also see in Mahashweta Devi to some degree, right? So you can make these correspondences. Another scholar, Summer Harrison, notes that Erdrich, like Linda Hogan, Joy Harjo, and others, believes that storytelling, environment, and identity are closely linked, and this is what she quotes Erdrich, an essay by Erdrich, which I haven't read the original essay, but this is what she quotes. Contemporary Native American authors have, therefore, a task quite different from other writers. In the light of enormous loss, they must tell the stories of contemporary survivors while protecting and celebrating the cores of cultures left in the wake of the catastrophe. And in this, there always remains the land. So there's something solid, even if it's being polluted, it's a little more, let's say, it's fragile, but it's a little less precarious than the humans. Harrison cites, I thought this was interesting because I haven't read her novel Four Souls, but she does like what a lot of writers do, uses some of the same characters. And this clues us into the title, Tracks. Nanapush says in this writer, Four Souls, I have left my own tracks too. I have left behind these words. And he's supposed to be speaking orally, right? But even as I write them down, I know they are merely footsteps in the snow. They will be gone by spring. New growth will cover them and me. The green in turn will blacken. All things familiar dissolve into strangeness. Even our bones nourish change. So by redefining words as tracks and deep tracks as a form of print, so he's not, you know, print, but this is the way. He links stories with the material world and also the political context of land use. He draws attention to how modern development affects the earth, particularly on native lands, but also to the historical aware narratives of progress that legitimate that impact, familiar to some of the other works we've talked. This deep printing through stories disrupts both the local woodlands and the communal identity of a people who left no tracks. The deep printing is also, there's another competing printing, which is infrastructure and deforestation and so forth. By comparing his own writing with plant life, Nanapush situates his words and himself in a larger natural cycle of decay and renewal. While he is clearly critical of deep printing, however, he neither calls for a wholesale rejection of modernity, nor offers his own account as a simple alternative. Instead, he self-consciously defines his story as a temporary and partial means of orientation. So Native Americans are known for tracking, right? And some still practice this, a few, where they can pick up, they can read the signs. In the American Army in the 1800s used to hire trackers, right? That was how they could find their way by natural signs. That, of course, is a skill rapidly disappearing. I'm almost done here. Let's see. So he partial means of orientation and as an impermanent but nourishing contribution to storytelling, which is also plant life. So plants, you're planting these stories. Although he acknowledges that his narrative cannot provide an objective or complete account of particular environments or identities, Nanapush's reflections on storytelling throughout the novel suggest the positive value of literary self-consciousness for examining both. Now, we've seen how Gift in Green, Scent of Pepper, this idea of you could look at this as the ways in which humans imprint themselves on the land, right? And make a lasting but productive engagement with the land. And I think that that's a useful way to read this. I also I'm going to continue on my laptop here by I think I did mention the referring back to the map. I forgot to read one paragraph, the hand-drawn map. And I thought this was interesting. This is from the website I mentioned. It's an article, actually, on a website called Art and Argument, Indigitization of a Kiowa Historical Map for Teaching and Research. International Journal of Geoinformation. So we have all kinds of ways. And this is what the authors say. One-way flows of knowledge are revealed when Cherokee or other indigenous informants who provide place names to Apple, Microsoft, or Google on the GPS realize that their own geographies are not represented. They are erased from the maps, hence the religious sites. Indigenous geographies are often trivialized as being local, vernacular, and particular to a culture which goes against the grain of technoscience, standardization, and universalization. So again, these are some of them are sociologists, some of them are geoscientists who are looking for ways to appreciate these maps, and also they give with pedagogy in mind. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind. So as I wrap up this particular lecture, I've only talked about M. Scott Momaday and two writers, right? Is that right? And Erdrich. There are many, many others, and I'm just not specialized enough to have read all of them. But if you're interested, as I said, eco-horror and speculative fiction by Native Americans as well is a big part of genre and best-selling in some cases. There's also, of course, eco-horror film, which we could talk about, and some Native American film in relation to this. Um, the the other thing I wanted to mention was, I think it's worth, this is sort of a footnote, not germane specifically to post-colonial eco-criticism, but certainly just very important, that there's a debate in the US about terminology. So Chicano, Chicana tends to relate to Mexican Americans specifically, but we have immigrants from all over Central America, South America, and so forth. Hispanic tends to be the broader term, all right? So Hispanic, sort of the broad term. Then you have the more specific term, Chicano, Chicano, that was used for many decades. Now there's a term Latinx. We had the term Latino, Latina, which still used. But as I have discovered, there's a big debate. A lot of Latinos do not like Latinx. One reason to use the X was to sort of be gender equivalent, but also perhaps also sexually equivalent, right? And it's a noble idea, but I don't know if it's going to catch on. It may, but I'm just letting you know that when we talk, for example, about, I'm jumping ahead to Native Hispanic literature. In the same way, with Native American writing, some there's a debate. So some of the Native Americans will say, yeah, we'll call us Indians. That's fine. We'll take ownership, even though Columbus was wrong, right? We're going to, but it's one of those cases where the group that's been victimized, rightly so, they have the license to use it as they want. So they'll call themselves Red Man, let's say, right, or Red. But we outsiders have to sort of be careful in how we use it. Same with terms like the N-word for blacks. African Americans use that all the time with each other. This also applies to any minority group, Jews, and others. So I want us to be just sensitive to this fact, because as groups become empowered, words matter, right? And it's hard sometimes to make my students understand that, my dominant white students. From the dominant, from the non-minority, and they can't really say, well, what's the big deal? But the thing is that they do matter, and they can become political, right? So I want us to keep that in mind. I'm coming close to the end here. We just have a few minutes, and there was something else I wanted to mention on the laptop, if I can find it. I think this mostly had to do with, here we are. So one thing that I'll talk about in the next lecture a little more is, remember how M. Scott Momaday is living in what is called New Mexico. I maybe should have put that on the map, which not surprisingly borders Mexico and was part of Mexico until 1848. And so there are Hispanics who have lived in Texas and other places for 4 centuries since the conquistadors came. On the other hand, and they're directly descended from the Spanish, but they're also Mexican, mestizaje. So when we get to the Hispanic literature, this overlaps, because some Native Americans have what we would say mestizaje or Hispanic blood. That's because we have artificially imposed those borders, right, and categories. So when we get to the Hispanic literature, keep in mind that we are not sort of leaving Native American literature behind. There's a lot of overlap. So for example, I'll talk about this in the next lecture. Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands book from 1980 is important, and I'll say more about it. But this very idea of borderlands, border studies, which is interdisciplinary, that pertains both to Mexican Americans because of migrations, right? but also Native Americans, because Native Americans still don't like borders. Not all of them were nomadic, some were settled. But when you have a powwow, for example, like where we are, we'll have people come from Canada. Some of them, there are tribes that are the same tribe that are in Canada and North America, just like the Kurds or there are many, many peoples around the world who straddle these modern borders. And so that becomes also a metaphor, a motif, and a metaphor as well as a lived reality. So I wanted to mention that. So if now we know that we can look to India for not directly the same thing, but I'm thinking of Amitav Ghosh's The Shadow Lines, right, about the division of Bengal. And that already, or any number of places in the world, right? But here it's continuing to be lived where you are sort of liminal, you're in a kind of liminal state, because some people will see you as unwanted, right? Yet you can say, my family's been here longer than yours, right? So I wanted to mention that. So terminology is crucial, as is the fact that there are many, many other works of literature out there. I will go ahead and stop there. I'm a couple minutes early, but we'll make up for it in the next lecture. Thank you.